The money my late father left for us was supposed to secure our future, but it was almost empty. The betrayal I uncovered left me no choice but to fight. I had been so careful with my financial planning. Ever since my dad passed away when I was 12, I knew that college would be expensive. But he had thought ahead, setting up a college fund for my sister and me. It wasn't massive, $80,000 total, split evenly, but it was supposed to be our safety net. It was supposed to make sure that we didn't struggle the way he had when he put himself through school. I had always assumed the money would be there when I needed it. My mom had control over the account since we were minors when it was set up, but that never seemed like a problem. She wasn't the best with money, but she had never given me a reason to doubt that the fund was being saved for us. So when I logged into the account to check the balance before finalizing my transfer to a state university, I wasn't expecting any surprises. I had done the math. Between the fund, my part-time job, and my scholarships, I would be okay. I wasn't living luxuriously, but I could make it work. That's why, when I saw the number staring back at me, my entire body went cold. $800. It had to be a mistake. My hands were shaking as I refreshed the page, but nothing changed. I checked the transaction history, praying that maybe I had misread something. But as I scrolled, my stomach twisted. The money was gone. Little by little, thousands of dollars had been withdrawn over the past 2 years. Some transactions were large, some small, but they all pointed to the same horrifying truth: someone had been draining the fund right under my nose. My first thought was that there had to be an emergency. Maybe medical bills? Maybe my mom had been struggling more than I realized? But that hope crumbled as I looked at the withdrawals more closely. Car payments, home renovation costs, even a charge for a luxury vacation package. I wanted to believe there was some kind of mistake, but deep down, I knew exactly what had happened. My mom had stolen my future. The realization sat like a stone in my stomach, heavy and suffocating. The more I stared at the account balance, the more a deep, burning rage started to replace the initial shock. My father had worked hard to ensure my sister and I had a future. He had planned for us, saved for us, and made sure that we wouldn't struggle when the time came to pursue higher education. And now, just like that, it was gone. I couldn't ignore the truth. My mother had taken the money. She was the only one with access. The withdrawals spanned months, even years, and they weren't small, necessary expenses. They told a story of selfishness. Thousands spent on home renovations that had never been mentioned, luxury purchases that never benefited my sister or me, and payments linked to expenses that had no connection to our family's well-being. It didn't make sense. There had never been talk of financial trouble. My body moved on autopilot as I collected evidence. Screenshots of the withdrawals, detailed notes on the dates and amounts, anything that would prove what had happened. A sinking feeling told me that this wouldn't be as simple as confronting her and demanding answers. If she had taken the money over such a long period, she knew exactly what she was doing. Frustration built as I pieced together the scale of the betrayal. It wasn't just the money itself, it was the deception. My mother had allowed me to believe my education was secure, that I had a foundation to rely on when I planned my future. I had been careful, resourceful, working part-time to cover smaller expenses, applying for every scholarship I could find, all while believing that the college fund would be there for tuition when I transferred. I hesitated before making the call, but there was no avoiding it. The moment my mother answered, her tone was as normal as ever, as if everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. I told her that I had checked the college fund, that there was only $800 left, and that I needed to know what had happened to the rest. At first, there was silence. Then came the excuses. She had planned to tell me, but things had been difficult. She had needed the money for the house, for my stepfather's family, for things that, in her mind, were more important than my education. Every word only fueled my anger. None of it had been an emergency. None of it had been unavoidable. These were choices she had chosen to take from her own children. Disgust built with every explanation. My stepfather's kids weren't her responsibility. They had their own father. My education, my sister's future, had been sacrificed for them without a second thought. The worst part was the casual way she spoke about it, as if it was no big deal, as if the money had always belonged to her and not to the children my father had left it for. Hanging up did nothing to ease the fury rising in my chest. There was no regret in her voice, no apology, no sign that she even considered this theft. For her, it was just money. But for me, it was years of security, years of planning, years of knowing that I had a future waiting for me. And if she had done this to me, then my sister's money was gone too. The weight of the betrayal only deepened as my thoughts turned to my younger sister. If the money was gone from my account, then hers had almost certainly been drained too. She was still in high school, unaware that the security she believed she had for college had already been taken from her. The thought made my chest tighten. It was one thing to steal from me, but to take away her future before she even had the chance to fight for it was beyond cruel. I needed to know for sure. Logging back into the bank account, I checked the linked fund that had been set up for my sister. The moment the balance loaded, a sick feeling washed over me. Just as I had feared, she had even less than I did, barely $500 left in what had once been her $40,000 college fund. Anger built with each transaction I scrolled through. The pattern was the same as mine, large sums disappearing in waves, most of them withdrawn in cash, making it impossible to track where the money had gone. The remaining transactions pointed toward the same wasteful spending I had already uncovered. My mother hadn't just stolen from us, she had done it carelessly, thoughtlessly, as if the money was hers to burn without consequence. I couldn't keep this from my sister. She deserved to know. But the idea of telling her, of watching her world crash down like mine had, made my stomach turn. She had worked so hard in school, always talking about her dream of attending a good university, of making our father proud. She still believed she had options. She had no idea that they had already been stolen from her. Despite my anger, I hesitated before calling her. It wasn't fair that she had to hear this over the phone, but there was no good way to break news like this. When she picked up, I could hear the usual brightness in her voice, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. I told her I had something important to talk about and asked if she had checked her college fund recently. The pause on the other end of the line was brief, followed by a confused response. Of course, she hadn't. She had no reason to. Just like me, she had believed the money was safe. I told her to check. The silence that followed after she logged in was deafening. Then came the questions. The disbelief. The growing panic. I could hear it in her voice. She was frantically trying to make sense of what she was seeing, grasping for an explanation that wasn't as devastating as the truth. But there was no other explanation. Telling her the rest, explaining where the money had gone, felt like delivering a death sentence. I heard the sharp intake of breath, the choked sound of realization. She wasn't just devastated, she was heartbroken. The betrayal ran even deeper for her. She was younger, more trusting. She still believed in the idea that family meant protection, that our mother had our best interests at heart. That illusion had been shattered in an instant. As she tried to process everything, her voice cracked. She had been making college plans just the night before, talking about her dream schools, excited about the future she thought she had. Now, those dreams had been ripped away. Hearing the devastation in her voice broke something in me. It wasn't just my future that had been stolen. It was hers too. And I wasn't going to let our mother get away with this. The more I thought about what had happened, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a crime. My mother had taken money that didn't belong to her, money that was meant for my sister and me, and used it for her own benefit. The college fund wasn't just some savings account she could dip into whenever she wanted. It was protected by legal guidelines, and she had violated them. I needed to understand exactly what my options were. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew that trust funds had legal protections in place to prevent misuse. My father had set up the account specifically for our education, and my mother, as the trustee, had a legal obligation to manage it responsibly. What she had done wasn't just unethical, it was a breach of fiduciary duty, which meant she could be held legally accountable. The first step was to gather all the proof I could. I went through every transaction, noting the dates and amounts, tracking where the money had gone. The spending patterns were obvious, withdrawals for things that had nothing to do with my sister or me. I compiled all the evidence into a folder, along with copies of the original trust documents that outlined the rules my father had set. Once I had everything organized, I started researching what legal action I could take. I found that I could potentially sue my mother for misappropriation of funds, and if the court ruled in my favor, she could be ordered to repay the money. But there was a catch. If she had already spent it, there was no guarantee she could pay it back. The money was likely gone, used for things that couldn't be undone. I also learned that I could file a petition in probate court to have her removed as trustee. That wouldn't bring the money back, but it would ensure she couldn't do further damage. Since my sister was still a minor, she was even more vulnerable to financial manipulation, and I couldn't let my mother continue controlling anything that was meant for her. The hardest part was realizing that going down this path would permanently change my relationship with my mother. There would be no fixing this. Even if she somehow managed to repay the money, the trust between us was gone. She had chosen to put her own desires over my future, over my sister's security, and now she would have to live with the consequences. I had to make a decision. I could let it go, accept that the money was gone, and try to move forward without making waves. Or I could fight back, knowing that it would tear my family apart, but also knowing that my mother deserved to be held accountable. For my sister's sake, for my father's memory, and for myself, I knew what I had to do. The decision to pursue legal action against my mother wasn't one I made lightly. No part of me wanted to go through the emotional strain of fighting my own family in court. But what choice did I have? Walking away would mean letting her get away with it, and that was something I couldn't stomach. This wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal, justice, and the principle of it all. My father had trusted her to do the right thing, and she had thrown that trust away. I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in trust litigation. It felt surreal sitting in a legal office, discussing a case against my own mother, but I forced myself to push through the discomfort. The lawyer reviewed my evidence carefully, screenshots of the transactions, copies of the original trust documents, and records of my attempts to communicate with my mother about the missing funds. He confirmed what I already suspected. My mother had illegally misused trust funds and could be held accountable in court. The first step would be filing a petition in probate court to formally remove her as trustee. This would prevent her from doing further damage and ensure she no longer had access to any remaining assets. While this wouldn't magically return the lost money, it was necessary to stop her from repeating the same actions with anything else my father had left behind. The second step would be pursuing a civil lawsuit to try to recover the stolen money. This was the harder part. If she still had assets, savings, property, or anything of value, she could be forced to use them to repay what she had taken. But if the money was completely gone, it would be much harder to get anything back. The court could still rule against her, but enforcing payment would be another battle entirely. My lawyer warned me that cases like this could take time. My mother would have the opportunity to defend herself, which meant she would likely come up with excuses or try to justify her actions. She might even claim that she had used the money for family expenses or that it had been necessary for our well-being. But legally, none of that mattered. The trust was created for a specific purpose, our education, and anything outside of that was a violation of fiduciary duty. After leaving the office, I sat in my car for a long time, processing everything. I knew this would cause chaos in my family. My mother would see this as a betrayal, as an attack, as something cruel and unnecessary. She would twist the story to make me the villain. There would be arguments, emotional manipulation, and backlash from relatives who would tell me to just let it go. But the reality was, I couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about me anymore. My sister had an entire future ahead of her, and she deserved to know that someone was willing to fight for her, even if it meant going against our own mother. My father had set this money aside for us, and I refused to let his efforts go to waste. I took a deep breath and made my next move. I filed the petition. Filing the petition against my mother set off a chain reaction I had been dreading. There was no way to keep something like this contained, not when it involved family, money, and betrayal. Within hours of receiving the legal notice, my mother unleashed a flood of messages, switching between outrage and self-pity. At first, she acted shocked, as if she genuinely couldn't understand why I would attack her like this. Then, when it became clear I wasn't backing down, the guilt-tripping and manipulation started. She called me selfish, ungrateful, and disrespectful. She accused me of trying to destroy our family over a little bit of money. She claimed she had always planned to return it, that she had only taken it because she had no other options, that I was cruel for turning my back on her after everything she had done for me. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The evidence was undeniable, and no amount of emotional blackmail would change the fact that she had knowingly stolen from me and my sister. Unfortunately, my mother wasn't the only one who had an opinion. Word spread quickly, and soon, extended family members began weighing in. Some, like my uncle on my dad's side, were horrified and supportive. He told me that my father had worked too hard for that money to be wasted and that I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself and my sister. Others, however, sided with my mother. My aunt, my mother's older sister, was the most vocal. She sent a long-winded message about how I needed to understand a mother's sacrifices and how I was being cruel for taking legal action against the person who had raised me. She insisted that my mother had only taken the money because she had needed it and that I was being unfair by treating her like a criminal. The worst part was knowing that some people actually believed that. To them, this was a family dispute, not a case of financial betrayal. They saw me as overreacting, as if my mother had borrowed a few dollars instead of completely wiping out my college fund. My sister, who was still in shock over losing her own savings, faced her own version of this. My mother had called her directly, crying, saying that I was turning her against our family, that I was brainwashing her. My sister, to her credit, didn't fall for it. She told me she didn't know who our mother was anymore, and that realization hurt her more than anything else. The fallout was just beginning, but I already knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. With the petition filed, the situation escalated faster than I had expected. My mother was furious, but she had no real defense. The court paperwork made it clear she had violated the terms of the trust, and now she had to answer for it. A court date was set for a preliminary hearing, where a judge would determine if there was enough evidence to proceed with a full case. I knew there was, but that didn't make the process any less stressful. My mother hired a lawyer, which meant she was prepared to fight this, but there was no argument that could justify what she had done. The withdrawals, the spending, the complete depletion of the funds, everything pointed to her guilt. Despite her legal trouble, she continued playing the victim. She spread rumors within the family, claiming that I was trying to ruin her life out of spite. Some relatives avoided getting involved, but others made it clear they saw me as the aggressor. My aunt accused me of being cold-hearted, while a few cousins questioned if suing my own mother was truly necessary. I refused to let their opinions sway me. My father had worked too hard to secure RF. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived sooner than I expected. Walking into the courthouse, I felt a mix of nerves, anger, and determination. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, collecting every piece of evidence to prove what my mother had done. But despite my confidence in the case, there was no way to prepare for the emotional weight of facing her in court. She was already seated when I arrived, dressed in a way that made it seem like she wanted to appear sympathetic, subtle, but deliberate. She avoided looking at me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Her lawyer, a man I had never met before, sat beside her, flipping through paperwork. My sister, who wasn't required to attend but had insisted on coming, sat next to me, gripping the armrest of her chair tightly. The judge reviewed the case details, stating the facts clearly. The trust had been created for the sole purpose of funding my sisters and my education. My mother had been named as the trustee, with the legal responsibility to manage the funds in accordance with my father's wishes. Instead, she had spent nearly every dollar on personal expenses, luxury items, and financial support for her new husband's children, none of which aligned with the purpose of the trust. Her lawyer attempted to argue that she had needed the money, that times had been hard, and that she had done what she thought was best for the family. But the evidence was stacked against her. Bank records showed large withdrawals over time, none of which had gone toward education expenses. The house renovations, the car payments, and the luxury purchases were all clearly outlined in the transaction history. There was no justifying what she had done. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day, that would come later, but the preliminary hearing determined that there was enough evidence to proceed with a full case. That meant my mother would have to formally answer for her actions in a court of law. As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange combination of relief and exhaustion. This was only the beginning, but I had taken the first real step toward holding her accountable. No matter how difficult the fight ahead would be, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without consequences. Futures, and my mother had taken that away without a second thought. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for my sister, for what was right. My lawyer prepared the case carefully, gathering every record, transaction, and document needed to prove my mother's breach of fiduciary duty. As the court date approached, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight to reclaim the future my mother had stolen. And I wasn't backing down. After the court hearing, the divide within my family became impossible to ignore. My mother, desperate to control the narrative, painted herself as the victim, claiming that I was punishing her over a misunderstanding. She spun the story to make it seem like I had turned against her over money, ignoring the fact that it wasn't hers to take in the first place. Some relatives took her side immediately, convinced that I was being too harsh. They repeated the same arguments I had already heard. Family matters shouldn't be settled in court. I was embarrassing my own mother, and I should have just let it go. My mother fueled this, acting as if I had left her no choice but to take the money, blaming me for being ungrateful instead of acknowledging her wrongdoing. Other family members, especially those who had known my father well, supported me. My uncle on my dad's side called to say he was proud of me for standing up for what was right. A few cousins reached out privately to tell me they agreed with what I was doing but didn't want to get involved publicly. The family group chat turned into a war zone, with people arguing back and forth, some defending my mother, others calling out her actions. The weight of it all was exhausting. I had expected backlash, but seeing people I had once trusted turn against me still hurt. My sister struggled with it even more. She had always been more forgiving than I was, but this betrayal shattered her in a way I hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't just angry, she was grieving the mother she thought she had. Despite everything, I knew I couldn't let the pressure from family sway me. The legal process had started, and I wasn't going to walk away from it now. My mother had stolen from us, and no amount of guilt-tripping or manipulation would erase that fact. The trial was approaching, and soon, she would have to answer for what she had done in front of a judge. And no matter how much she tried to spin the story, the truth would come out. The final court date arrived with an overwhelming sense of finality. I had spent months preparing, gathering evidence, and enduring the emotional strain of fighting my own mother in court. No amount of preparation could fully brace me for what was about to happen, but I was ready to see this through. My mother sat across the courtroom, visibly tense but still putting on an air of defiance. Her lawyer repeated the same weak justifications, that she had used the money for family needs, that she had intended to pay it back, that taking legal action against her was excessive. But none of that mattered. The records spoke for themselves. The trust had been drained on luxury expenses, home renovations, and financial help for my stepfather's children. None of it had gone toward my or my sister's education, as my father had intended. The judge delivered the verdict, ruling in our favor. My mother was officially found guilty of breach of fiduciary duty and was legally ordered to repay the funds. The court stripped her of any control over what little remained, ensuring that she could no longer touch anything else that belonged to my sister or me. While it was unlikely she could pay everything back immediately, the ruling meant that she would be held financially responsible for the debt. Any assets she had, savings, property, even future earnings, could be used to settle what she had stolen. As the judge finished reading the decision, my mother looked stunned, as if she had never truly believed this would happen. For the first time, I saw something that almost looked like regret in her expression, but it was too little, too late. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Relief, justice, exhaustion, but also sadness. This wasn't how I had wanted things to turn out, but she had left me no choice. My sister, standing beside me, was quiet for a long moment before finally saying what we were both thinking. We had won, but we had lost a mother in the process. In the weeks that followed, the fallout continued. Some family members cut ties with me entirely, blaming me for ruining my mother's life. Others, particularly those on my father's side, supported me wholeheartedly. My mother, humiliated and bitter, refused to speak to me, only sending one last message, a half-hearted attempt at blaming me for what had happened, still unwilling to take responsibility. But none of it mattered anymore. The damage had been done long before the trial. I had fought for my future, for my sister's future, and for my father's legacy. No matter what came next, I knew one thing for sure. I had done the right thing.